Member White Alice? Knutson? Stringer?
Here.
Stahl?
Here.
Mullen?
Present.
Alternate Carmen?
Here.
Alternate Westfall?
Just wanted to state real quickly, since we had two, or one normal member absent, member Knutson had indicated he had other arrangements he had made previously and wasn't available tonight. So in the instance where there's, one of our regular members unavailable, an alternate steps in priority. Mr. Carmen is the first alternate, so he will be serving in the full capacity tonight, meaning as a full voting member.
Any additions or deletions from the agenda?
No, sir.
Public forum, anything outside the non-agenda items? Think so?
I don't see.
Consideration of minutes. Meeting minutes from April 27th, 2023.
I moved to accept the minutes. Second.
Roll.
Member White Alice?
Yes.
Stringer?
Yes.
Stahl?
Yes.
Mullen?
Yeah.
Carmen?
Yes. New business.
Good evening, Cody Bird. I'm planning director for the town. We have a presentation slideshow here for you. It's in your packet as well. The meeting tonight, this action item is consideration of a variance request. The variance in this instance is proposed by applicant Ms. Twyla Souls. She's the owner and operator of Grouse Malting and Roasting. And her proposal tonight includes a request for the variance that would allow the expansion of that business to include a bar or tavern with production and serving of alcoholic beverages on site. This is a variance request to reduce the setback between a bar or tavern located in the light industrial zone district. The separation distance is, the requirement is 500 feet from a residential use. And in this instance, the existing site conditions are in an area that is close to residential properties. And therefore the existing site does not comply with the 500-foot setback that was established in the Land Use Code 2022 adoption. The request is to reduce that setback from 500 feet to 158 feet to allow redevelopment of the site, including the bar tavern use. Slides are moving slow. If at all, there we go. We probably cycle through too many. All right, so here's the vicinity map and location. This property is located on First Street on the south side of Cleveland Avenue. It's the location of the historic grain elevator in Wellington. And the site has previously been the home of another bar, tavern, or tap room use for Old Colorado Brewing Company, which is since located to a new location in town. The standard that's being requested to vary from is 4.03.3. As I mentioned, a bar or tavern located within 500 feet of a residential district or use. This exhibit kind of illustrates the what we're using is the closest wall of the building to the residential properties, and you can see here that 158 feet from the nearest residence, 263 feet from a residential property on the west side of the railroad tracks, and the dotted line around the perimeter is the 500 feet that is the current setback requirement. The applicant's seeking a reduction of this to the 158 feet illustrated on this map to accommodate the proposed bar or tavern. And in the narrative, the applicant also included a description of some of the community events for limited audiences with the potential to grow to broader audiences in the future. And in your packet, we included in the, yes, Ms. Mullen.
Can I have clarification on this rendering? Which direction is this rendering facing?
This is facing west. So what you're seeing would be the front wall of the building from First Street from a slightly elevated position to kind of illustrate the site.
Didn't have mountains in it, so I was like,
Yeah, this is the east elevation facing west. So here again, just some kind of further background information. As I mentioned, the business, Grouse Malting and Roasting, is currently operating the manufacturing use where they roast malt. And that's primarily, it's a permitted use in the light industrial zone district. The property is zoned light industrial. It's been zoned light industrial since 2007 when the town adopted its own local zoning ordinance. And the malt business has been operating, or at least the approval was in 2013 and has been operating shortly thereafter and continuously. As we mentioned, there was a previous tap room at this location. Old Colorado Brewing was approved in, or a conditional use was approved for a tap room in 2013. The original applicant for that conditional use did not proceed. I wasn't here. I don't know all the reasons why, but that conditional use approval was then picked up by Old Colorado Brewing in around 2015, 2016 timeframe. And so Old Colorado Brewing had operated there during that time period. As I mentioned, the applicant, Ms. Souls, is seeking to create an event center for hosting events at this facility. The applications that Ms. Souls has submitted includes the variance request tonight. She's also submitted a proposed site plan for redevelopment of the site, including parking, screening, landscaping, sidewalks, all the things that are identified as requirements under the current land use code. So there's a really great effort being put forth by the applicant to address all of the current standards for site development. There are some existing constraints on the site that don't allow all of those to be satisfied. The planning commission will have an ability to take a look at the site plan scheduled for June 12th. So that's in process for the planning commission to look at the site design elements. The applicant, Ms. Souls, is also pursuing a liquor license for the center is probably not the right word, but for the proposed bar tavern use. And that'll be heard by the liquor licensing authority, which is the board of trustees at a later date. So all of those applications have been submitted and are being processed for the applicant. The variance, as I mentioned, is for the 500-foot setback. 158 is the proposed kind of minimum reduction needed to operate the proposed use on the site. And just some of the background too, in addition to the prior use having some precedence there with another tap room on this location. The context here too was that when that original use for the tap room was approved, it was approved as a conditional use. At that time, the light industrial zone district didn't allow the malting roasting business or the bar tavern uses as a use by right. They were allowed as conditional uses, which meant they had to go through an approval process to obtain those uses. And those were both granted in the past, 2013 for the malting, 2013 as well for the conditional use, and then 2015 is when Old Colorado took advantage of that conditional use approval. When the town updated the zoning code in 2022, there was a lot of concern we heard from the public that we needed to create better separation from some of the more intense land uses in the areas from residential uses to create buffer spaces. During that process, there was a lot of consideration to how do we separate those uses, and the buffer distance was identified as the preferred method for doing that. And so when the land use code was updated in 2022, two things happened. First of all, the light industrial manufacturing type uses were changed from a conditional use to an allowed use in the light industrial district, as were bars and taverns, breweries, micro distilleries were identified as permitted uses in those zone districts or in the light industrial zone district. So the conditional use process that Ms. Souls went through before is no longer a requirement because they're used by right. The trade-off, though, was instead of the conditional approval, the variance process is a tool to consider unique requests where that buffer setback distance was required to mitigate potential adverse impacts from those uses that were allowed as by right. So I wanted to highlight those couple of things. Those are the reasons why the applicant has identified the potential hardships for this site. And again, that there was a prior use approval for that. Additionally, I also want to point out too, that as part of the zone map, or as part of the land use code update, the transitional zone district, which was a commercial zone district, was eliminated. It just didn't provide clarity for what was going to be there. The owners didn't have a clear expectation of what they could do with their property. Owner or neighbors, potential purchasers didn't have a clear picture of what they could do with a transitional zone property. It required any new use to obtain conditional use approvals, which was not a very clear process. And so that district was eliminated. And as a result, the properties that were previously zoned transitional had to be zoned to something different. During the zone map update process, properties along McKinley that were zoned transitional before, we heard very clearly from those owners of those properties that they wanted to have a residential zone category. And so in addition to the land use code changes, when the zone map was updated, properties that had previously been a commercial category closer to this facility were then zoned residential, which shortened that setback distance even more for the applicant for their existing site at 8121 First Street. So that's some background context for kind of why we're here tonight to hear this variance request. So this is a public hearing item. Almost every item that comes before the Board of Adjustments is a public hearing. Now that you have the background and introduction, the Board of Adjustments will consider findings of fact or findings for approval, which are outlined in the land use code, as these are the criteria that the board will look at to evaluate a variance request. We've got slides that are in your packet. We've got them here tonight too. It kind of helps guide. These are the different points that we're required to look at. You can form opinions based on each of those findings. Staff will be recording kind of what we're hearing from you, and we can help you report back. This is what we heard for each of those findings to kind of create the record of what was considered and kind of some consensus building. At the end of that, you'll vote on the agenda item. Before we dive into the findings for approval, though, just to kind of remind you our public hearing procedures. You've received an introduction. I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Souls here in just a moment to share any additional information that the applicant would like to add to this introduction. We'll allow public comment. I don't see anyone here just at the moment. If anyone were to come in, we would allow that comment. And oh, very good. Very good. Thank you. So after public comment, then the applicant will have a chance to respond to any comments heard. Staff will respond to any comments, and then the board will be able to ask any further questions, and you can deliberate on the findings. We can kind of help guide you through this. I do also want to ask, as part of our public hearing process, if there are any conflicts of interest, if you could disclose those now, and if there are any ex parte communications, if you could also disclose any ex parte communications, meaning things you learned outside of a public hearing, so that everyone here has the same information. Any communications or conflicts?
I don't know that it's a conflict, but I just want to make it clear to those who may not know that I also serve on the Planning Commission.
Thank you, Mr. Carmen. And the Planning Commission will be presented with a site plan for this project at a later date. Thank you.
Do I need to disclose that I sent an email to the board asking a question? I sent an email to you all asking a question whether or not the town had received any official complaints against the previous tenant that left in 2019, any noise complaints or any formal complaints against them, and you hadn't had a chance to respond, and that's fine. But I just wanted to say I did ask if there were any official complaints against the previous tenant.
Thank you. That's a perfect way to communicate that. Staff was not able to research that and respond just yet. I can answer that I'm not aware of any that were filed. There were none filed during my tenure here. I can't speak to before that, but we could do some additional research if that's a concern. And Ms. Souls may be able to speak to that as well in a moment when she comes up here.
I wasn't expecting any. I just wanted to ask as a matter of formality, so.
It's a great question, and to my knowledge, there have been none. We have not had an opportunity to do specific research.
It was nice of you to ask the meeting now, because there was something that needed to be looked at, but we didn't even find out about this till yesterday.
And I didn't think of the question until like right before the meeting, and I was like, oh, so.
So
Yeah.
we get a chance to ask questions.
Yeah, absolutely. So any other questions on process? Okay, then I would like to invite Ms. Twyla Souls up to, as the applicant, to share any additional information about your proposed project or your application for a variance.
All right, thank you. Yeah, thank you, Cody and Paul, for your help with this. I'm Twyla Souls, happy to be here this evening, and thank you for hearing out this request. I think there's been a lot of information in the packet already presented, and happy to answer any questions, but we're really excited to be a part of a thriving downtown community, a historic core, to make a more walkable event space for services and events for area residents. So if you have any questions, happy to.
What type of events are you anticipating?
Mostly live music initially. That's the kind of reason behind getting this going initially. I'm a musician as well as my partner, so we just really think that Wellington could use some more live music. We also intend to have it be, a place where people can gather as a community for a graduation party, a retirement party, those type of events.
Are you seeking a full liquor license or just a beer and wine license?
We are seeking a full liquor license.
In the packet, it said that you're aware that the buffer zone was to lower the impact to the residential neighborhoods and that you made an adjustment to hours and some things were going to be inside and some things were going to be outside with limited hours. Can you explain a little bit how you intend to kind of, I'm guessing noise would be the largest concern in the houses that are kind of in that area?
That's definitely something that's on the table to limit hours. I think it was proposed, not sure what that was. And that's definitely something that we're open to. I guess for the noise, we're very much aware that we're in a residential community and we don't want to be a nuisance to our residents. We intend to, as you saw in the picture, put up a barrier, put up quite a bit of landscaping and trees as well as a fence. So that's.
Would you intend to be open past midnight then?
Oh, no,
Oh,
not-
okay.
definitely not past midnight.
Okay.
No, and
Would the live music be inside or outside the venue?
it depends on the season, ideally outside for the summer if we're able to.
Question for Cody. City currently has a noise ordinance, is that right?
We do have, excuse me, the town does have a noise ordinance. The noise ordinance is defined as after dark or after 10 o'clock. If there is a noise complaint, a deputy may arrive on scene and may determine based on prima facie evidence, meaning I can see it or hear it right now, and make a determination as to the reasonableness of the noise volume.
Okay.
It does not specify decibels or very much, except that the
Or
peace
hours.
officer or hours, the peace officer may make a determination as to whether or not the noise is reasonable or unreasonable.
Okay, thank you.
A
And-
quick process question too. If this variance is passed, do future tenants have to reapply for the variance or is this grandfathered in forever?
Great question. And the variance runs with the land. So the business owner or operator may change, the name may change, all those changes may happen, but the use for the property would run with that land. So any other brewery could come in and operate under that variance process or under that variance approval.
Okay.
Mhm.
And then I did see, and this may not be a question for you or maybe more so for Cody, but it looked like on page 22, the 158 request for variance, that's just on the east side of the property. The west side of the property also is not within the current 500 feet limit, right? But by setting, so my understanding is that by focusing on a smaller portion, we're addressing what's happening on
whole
the west
circle.
side as well.
Mhm,
Okay.
mhm.
Yeah, we would. There, in other circumstances, not in this particular application, but in other variance applications, there have been similar circumstances where we've identified like east side this reduction, north side this reduction sort of scenario. In this particular instance, the west side, the 158 is in the middle of the railroad tracks. And so
Right.
the railroad is not going to go anywhere. And so it's almost not necessary to do that.
Sure.
Um,
And that's reasonable. I guess the question that comes to my mind, I like what you're proposing with respect to the landscaping on the east side. Is there any consideration for doing something similar on the west side? And I don't even know that you have room for that, honestly. But
Yeah, the property doesn't run at quite the angle on that side, but we are planning on putting up an 8-foot perimeter fence on that side,
on the west side.
on the west side.
Okay.
And
And
the
the
north
east
side,
side, would there be any kind of fencing on the west or just mainly landscaping?
mainly landscaping.
Yeah.
Oh, well, I shouldn't say that. On the street side, it is mainly landscaping, but on to the east of the patio, there will be a fence.
Okay.
This is gonna be my architecture background, because I tried to zoom into the site plan and couldn't quite tell. I'm just trying to get an idea for sound, because whatever you put in probably would stand for the next tenant, as far as entry and exit. Are the entries and exits and where most of the music would happen, is it shielded by the building? Would they mostly happen out in front, like in the parking lot and patio? Or would anything, I'm thinking of the west side, the Wellington West that runs along the railroad track down there. Is the building gonna shield where you envision the music happening?
That
So it
is-
would also help with sound?
Yeah, that is the plan, that the performers would be facing towards the building. But it would be on the north side of the property, so there is about 70 feet but it would be facing then towards the building.
And you would have a fence?
And we would have the fence on
Okay.
the east and the west side of that.
And all of the entry from the parking lot and everything is on the east facing side of the building?
Yes.
So there's not really anything on the west, like people are not gonna be coming in and out?
No, and it's definitely a goal to block that off.
Yes, no, I'm just making, I'm just trying to get everything in my head, because the site plan was just on my iPad, hard to zoom in on, so I was.
Can you
Yeah,
put
one
this up?
one access from First Street.
What's your occupancy now, Max?
That is a work in progress with the site plan and the building department and fire. Possibly under 49 inside. So relatively limited inside, so.
And outside?
And outside, it is kind of dependent on the parking, and that's still in progress for the site plan.
And what about any kind of lighting considerations?
Yeah, we've done a photometric study, and there will be the required lighting in the parking lot and on the building. for out-
So from a safety perspective, sure, but what about from a performance perspective? Like there, if you have an outside performance, we all expect,
Are you gonna have bright
Audio.
lights?
but will there be any additional lighting for that performance aspect?
You know, that isn't something that we've looked at yet, but I know that there are specific requirements for how hot you can be outside of, our property, and we'll
Right.
definitely make sure we're
Okay.
in compliance there.
Cody, I can't remember. Did the previous brewing tenant have outdoor music, or did they only do the music inside? Do you remember?
I do. They did have outdoor music.
Okay, and
Yeah.
there was no public outcry, like no formal complaints.
Correct.
Okay.
As I mentioned earlier, I'm not aware of any complaints that were filed. I can't speak to things that happened before me. And we didn't have an opportunity to do any specific research on that, but our staff isn't aware of any at this time.
Do you have any plans for So I get the street side and I love what you guys are proposing there. What about north of the property? Any plans there for any landscaping, fencing on the north side?
Fencing, definitely,
okay.
8 foot, hopefully, 6 at
Yeah.
the minimum.
Okay.
It's- It's a rental storage place next to you, or north of you, isn't it?
Vehicle?
There's,
Things.
Yes.
Eclectic.
I'm
and
sorry.
There's business mix there as well.
Yeah.
It's a
north.
collection.
Yeah.
of-
What about south? What about the south side?
yeah, the south side, there is a lot south of, the lot that, and it's vacant currently. And then there is a 7, or it is about 7 foot fence there. And then it's the back of a mixed use, property, but there are no windows in that. It's, yeah, it's a 2-story building that there's no windows or access from the north side.
Have you visited personally with any of the most impacted residential sites?
I have, and maybe he'll be willing to
Oh,
speak.
okay,
Yeah.
excellent. Okay. Well, no, I just wanted
Okay.
to know if you'd taken the time to just to talk to the people who would be most impacted and
Mhm.
That was one of my questions was, were the neighbors, the closest neighbors notified and have there been any objections?
I believe that everyone within 500
Oh,
feet
within
radius
500 feet.
was notified. Mhm.
Yeah,
Mhm.
and Ms.
That's
Souls
all the
was-
way out to Cleveland. I mean, that's.
Yeah,
a lot.
the notification area in our land use code is 500 feet from the property that is requesting a public hearing. And those notices are published in the Fort Collins, Colorado, and there's a sign posted on site. And notices were sent to individual property owners within that 500-foot radius.
By mail.
Yes,
And-
by
yeah.
US mail. And we did not receive any, staff did not receive any responses from those notifications that were sent out.
When this was, it was always been light, well, for a long time, it's been light industrial. Is this 500-foot setback only for bars and malt places, or is that for any use? Any
It's-
light
No,
industrial
it's
use?
for
It's
liquor.
within the light industrial zone district, there are a couple of uses that are identified as use by right, meaning they don't have to go through a conditional process, that they're allowed to be there. But there are use standards for certain types of uses.
Oh.
So
So
in
this is one
instance,
of those.
this is one of
Okay.
those, correct? And there are others as well. And depending on the type of allowed use, some of those use standards are different. The bar or tavern was 500 feet. Other uses are 250 feet. It depends on which use is being referred to.
And I realize these places are probably grandfathered in, but Soul Squared and the Grill and the T-Bar, I believe they're a lot closer than 158 feet from the nearest house.
They are, and that's a great question that you bring up. It's actually one of the things that the staff alludes to in the findings or staff's opinion of findings. The light industrial zoning here along First Street has been in place for a long time. One could officially under the town zoning since 2007, but one could argue a grain elevator that's over 100 years old, that's been a 100-plus-year-old light industrial use.
A
But
pretty noisy business, actually.
at least in its heyday.
Yeah, right.
It
But uniquely to the area, the businesses along Cleveland are not zone light industrial, they're zone C2 downtown core commercial. And within the C2 core commercial category, the bars and taverns do not require a setback buffer. That was identified as an area of the town that is an entertainment, family restaurant, social space, and so those setback buffers were not required. The light industrial categories require that separation distance because it was a different consideration. That's one of the things that staff identifies as reason why we support this is the close proximity of the site on First Street is really probably part of the downtown and want to encourage that walkability to event centers and places of business to encourage that downtown business growth. When we looked at the zoning map updates in the land use code, some of these areas along First Street were identified as why don't we just zone those downtown core commercial because it's close to downtown, but that would have negatively impacted many of our existing businesses that have that light industrial use category. We didn't want to immediately put those uses into a non-conforming status where they wouldn't be able to have all the same pleasures that they do as the use by right. So there was definitely some consideration there, and that's one of the things that staff feels really strongly about, that the proximity of this site to the downtown that doesn't have that setback buffer makes it pretty unique and justifies a variance.
I think this is interesting because on one hand, you have the spirit of the new land use code that is to protect residents where perhaps they haven't been protected by code before. But you also have historic use that's gone without any problem in an area that probably could use a nice tap room and music. I don't know if there's a process thing. Is there anything we can do? I think if we approve the variance, believing that this tenant is going to be very honoring of the spirit of that separation, and that's why we are granting this variance. Is there anything we can add to our approval that will help a future tenant need to or want to respect the same spirit? Because it's not so much that I have questions about whether or not this tenant would uphold that spirit. But do we need to, or should we, or can we add anything to the approval that would encourage a future tenant to also embrace the spirit of being a good neighbor to the existing community that's there?
Absolutely. And one of the things that the Board of Adjustments in considering a variance, you really have a couple of options. You can approve a variance without conditions. You can approve a variance with conditions. Those conditions are stated in the land use code, not specifically prescribed. These are the conditions you should consider, but it's stated that they should further the spirit and intent of the regulations. So you can include conditions of approval. Your other option is you can deny a variance. And you can always table it if you need more information. That's always an option. We hope that we've provided enough information for you tonight to take an action. But I throw it out there because it is an option. In the staff report, staff did recommend a number of conditions for consideration. Those conditions in staff's opinion would get to the spirit and intent of protecting the residential character of the adjacent properties. But it's not to say that staff has thought of everything. If there are other conditions that the board wants to consider, or you can modify the recommendations that staff has given. A lot of times we encourage you to hear public testimony. Sometimes things in public comment come up that we haven't thought of because those people live nearby and understand the situation differently than we do. So hear those comments, and maybe there's a condition of approval that can be included to help mitigate potential concerns that we might hear.
I read those. I just wanted to I just wanted the clarification that we are not only looking at this tenant, but
Sure.
but making sure that those conditions would then apply as long as it's zoned what it's zoned.
Yeah, the conditions of approval would just like the variance carries with the land, meaning any future user would also enjoy that variance. The conditions of approval would also carry forward with that variance.
And the new tenant would have to apply for a liquor license as well.
Correct. Anytime a new liquor operator comes in, the operator has to get licensed.
Yeah,
Right.
And that can be revoked and like.
yeah, and they look at
But
every
You could-
violation
you could,
previous.
yes, you could, but I'm just saying, not that we plan ever an unruly tenant, but there's a lot of things you could do without a liquor license there. Maybe not a bar, but I agree. You're right.
I do want to just mention that I submitted this application as Soul Squared LLC, which is the owner of the property. So that's the variance that's in front of us today.
Great. Thank you. That was one of my questions too. So I appreciate you answering that before I even asked it. So on that basis, then the conditions here, I think, hit all of my hot buttons with one amendment that I thought of, but I want to hold until we hear all the comments.
By piece, right? We have to put in the conditions as we're voting.
So
Discuss them now.
let me clarify procedurally so that we don't get too far off track, because Mr. Carmen, you're right, and Ms. Mullen, you're right as well. We've not yet opened the public hearing to hear testimony, so we want to make sure that we accomplish that tonight as well. This has kind of been an effort to answer high-level questions, procedural questions, technical aspects, and applicant feedback. So it might be a good time to move into public comments. Once we finish public comments and there's a chance to respond to those comments by the applicant and staff, then we'll go through the findings for approval. We've kind of structured that in the staff report and in the presentation slides. It's kind of a item by item. That's kind of the way that I've learned works the best, but we don't have to follow that. We can certainly modify it a little bit, but at the very end of that consideration of the findings, we'll discuss as a group, the board can determine what are the appropriate conditions that you would like to include. And then if there's consensus, staff will help read those back to you based on your input. And then the vote would likely include either approval with no conditions, approval with some conditions, or a denial, and we'll help you craft that motion.
Yeah, I completely agree with that from a process standpoint. So my question would be, should there be conditions that are included in an approval? What's the mechanism to ensure that those conditions are maintained? Or,
Yeah.
honored,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, so it's two parts. When a variance is approved by the Board of Adjustments, the Board of Adjustments is the only authority that gets to look at variance proceedings. So your decision is final. And those conditions, if a variance is approved with conditions, actually, just if a variance is approved, we send that variance approval with the determinations and the conditions to the title company. We record that with Larimer County assessors, not assessors, the clerk and recorder. Thank you. So it's a recorded document. So anytime the property changes hands, that record of this was the approval, these were the conditions is included in that title binder. And then staff has that available. So if there's a concern raised by a resident that, hey, it's getting kind of unruly over there, we can go back, look at those conditions of approval and determine whether or not there's a violation of those conditions.
Great, thank you.
Very welcome.
Opened up for a public hearing.
All right. Hi there. Thanks for having me. My name's Josiah Burke. I am a homeowner at the property at 3701 McKinley Avenue, which is the house right on the corner of First and McKinley. So being the closest residence to the property, I figured I better voice my opinion and I just want knowing that at least for my part there, I'm 100% in support of the motion to reduce that distance requirement for a couple reasons. First being that when I first became a homeowner there and bought the place in 2021, it was one of the selling points that I'd be right next to the brewery, and it was kind of a beloved location at that time for many of my neighbors and family and for friends. So as far as like property value is concerned, that's a bonus in my opinion. I've been a resident of Wellington since 2001, so I've kind of seen things come and go. I also think that the addition of the proposed changes that Twyla wants to make there would be beneficial to me and the people that live near me. Also encourages people to walk to a location that serves alcohol rather than driving. So we appreciate that local walking distance to places. And also on the note of noise, I don't see anything different in what I expect coming from her establishment than we already get from the Wellington Grill and some of the other places that do live music, and not to mention the train that runs by there all day and all night. Like, yeah, everybody who lives there, like we bought the place. We know what we're expecting over there with regards to noise. So that's not a concern for me at all. So I just wanted to make that known, that as the closest resident, I'm in 100% support. And my brief time interacting with Twyla, I trust her to be a responsible neighbor, and she's been very professional and neighborly and for friendly, and I trust that she'll be cognizant of everybody around her, so I have no issues there. So, yeah, if you have any questions for me as the local resident, go for it. Thank you.
I'm just glad you came. It really helps.
Oh, yeah.
a
Oh,
lot.
yeah, absolutely.
We don't
Yeah.
sit here going, did they just, anybody who objected just not make it tonight?
Actually, yeah, I firsthand know how kind of how difficult it is to get things moved across. My mother-in-law owns the manor, the Wellington Manor, so kind of know that it takes some voices to get things moving. So yeah, just wanted to make sure that was known. All right, cool.
Thank you
Thanks.
very much. Close the public hearing if there's nobody else.
Okay, I don't see anyone else.
Yeah, I don't see anyone else.
So public hearing closed at 7:44. At this time, Ms. Souls, did you want to respond to any of the public comments? And staff doesn't feel the need to respond either. Really appreciate Mr. Burke coming and speaking tonight. So at this time, if there's any other questions, we can certainly answer those. Otherwise, we can move into the findings for approval. I do have those pulled up in our PowerPoint presentation, so I can share that screen again. Choose the right one. So as this is loading up here, the findings for approval are out of the land use code. And it's slow. There it is. So these are A through H, and we've just presented them as they appear in the land use code. So I'll kind of start by going through these. And if I would encourage you to kind of consider them finding by finding. If you want to do it differently, I'm certainly open to that, but that's my recommendation. So the first finding is that the relief requested is consistent with the comprehensive plan and the intent of the land use code. There's a lot more detail in the staff report. We tried to keep the slides brief, but staff's opinion is that this request for a variance is supported by the comprehensive plan and the land use code. There are a couple of factors in the comprehensive plan that encourage the theme of the agricultural heritage of the community. And what better way to support that agricultural heritage than to protect one of our great landmarks with the old historic mill, to breathe some additional life into that site. The comprehensive plan also has goals for balancing industrial, commercial, and residential land uses. And staff's opinion is that this site does accomplish those. Certainly there was some vigor put into the land use code to protect separation of incompatible land uses like residential and light industrial and light bar and taverns. It was staff's opinion that the proposed site plan does a nice job of mitigating potentially adverse impacts through the use of landscaping, aesthetics, fences, to mitigate some of the noise. Staff did recommend that hours of operation for outdoor activities. I don't know if that was real clear in the staff report, but we said outdoor activities might have those hours of operations limited just for the noise. Yes, Ms. Mullen.
I was just reading that part. You said downtown has an outdoor music cutoff at 10?
What staff had proposed is,
One says 11, but I was just curious.
yeah, and that's certain days of the week. What staff was looking at was, rather than trying to create something unique for an individual site, we were pointing to hours of operation that are use standard requirements for other similar types of uses. And so what we had proposed was 8 PM for outdoor activities Monday through Thursday, 11 PM for outdoor activities Friday through Sunday. So that was staff's recommendation based on some other existing code standards for other types of uses.
But is downtown 10 PM on Friday and Saturday nights?
I would have to research that. I don't know it offhand.
I just was thinking that when we make the recommendation, that we make the recommendation equal to what is already being done for other businesses of that type in the same area.
Do you have a copy of the land use code?
No.
Okay.
I mean,
Maybe,
can we even word it that way? Can we make that the condition that it is?
I think we would want to, we certainly could. I think we would want to make certain we knew what those were so that we
Okay.
didn't.
I just thought I
Yeah.
heard you say 10 PM, so I was just, that was one of my clarification questions. You can keep going.
Yeah, no, understood. In the staff report, we had recommended 11 PM for just the weekend days. But we can certainly,
8 PM for the weekdays.
yeah,
Yeah.
and I'm sorry, I did misspeak. I said Friday through Sunday. I think what we'd actually recommended was
Right.
Sunday through Thursday, Friday, Saturday could be open till 11. And that was staff's recommendation, so it's not a requirement currently. It could be a condition of approval worth considering. We can certainly dig into, and I can look it up here in a moment. I just have the screen share going on. But we can look up those downtown business hours. In addition, so going back to this finding, just wanted to quickly wrap up on the staff's analysis and recommendations. The comprehensive plan, the future land use map identifies this area as light industrial, which is the current zoning and use, so that is appropriate. Bars and taverns are a permitted use in the zoning code, so that, in staff's opinion, satisfies that. The intent of the separation distance was to mitigate potentially adverse impacts between residential and bars and taverns, and we feel like that is the spirit and intent of that is being accomplished through site design, siting, building, massing, fences, and screening. Any discussion on finding for approval, letter A?
I agree with finding A as it's been described.
I think there are other uses of this property that could potentially result in the grain silo being demolished. And I think that would be a sad loss for Wellington. It's kind of an iconic, it's one of our only iconic buildings. And I think historically, just it's worth a note that I think other light industrial uses could potentially not architecturally even have a use for, or really need the land space. So even though we would get a 500-foot setback, we would have a wasted historic building. And I actually think that's a pro for me. I also agree, I think with the conditions, with some conditions, I agree with approving it because I think it's wonderful that this use uses an existing building and celebrates a little bit of our history instead of demolishing it.
Thank you. I'm taking some notes because I'm gonna want to refer back to these as part of your findings and conditions. So I wanted to I'm just jotting a few things down.
Do I need to state which recommendations I think, or can we just say basically as stated, the staff recommendations, except where I do think we should check that 10 PM, 11 PM thing, but.
I don't know that these are recommendations at this point so much as they are, do we have agreement on the findings? Because we've got like 8 or 9 findings that we agree or disagree on, right? And
Yeah.
then once that's completed, then we make a motion that may or may not have conditions.
Okay,
right?
perfect. Then I
Yeah.
agree.
Yeah. And yeah, and I think you made a good point too about other potential light industrial uses that could otherwise locate here that might lose that landmark in the old grain mill. So
Basically,
But-
funding A is,
that's what I'm hearing.
I think
And,
so.
and that's
I
what I'm documenting. I am just also making a record of the
Sure.
reasons why
Yes,
it was a
thumbs up.
positive finding.
Yes.
Thumbs up.
Yeah, we can all just do that.
Yeah, and then when we're finished going through the findings, then there'd be some discussion on what are the appropriate recommendations or conditions of approval. Yep. Okay, thank you.
I might propose
Mhm.
that if we have a reaction to the finding before the additional discussion, and only have the additional discussion if there's not a consensus
Mhm.
on the finding. Is that an option?
We can just do this.
Yeah.
Yeah,
We can
I'm,
just do thumb, we'll just do thumbs up to
That's right.
the leader. here.
I'm perfectly fine with that.
Okay.
Just as a clarification for staff, I want to make sure everyone's thinking the same way. Is a thumbs up just we think it's a positive finding, or is a thumbs up, we agree with the staff analysis of that finding?
Oh, that's a good point.
More than
I just,
likely.
I just want to make sure, because I've run into that situation before where it's like, well, yeah, we thought it was a positive finding, but we didn't like what staff said. So I just want to make sure I understand what the intent is.
I think we'll say it's a positive finding.
We'll let you know.
And then if we have discussion over some of the staff recommended staff findings, then we'll talk about it.
Okay, that sounds perfect. Thank you. So finding B is that strict application of the regulation will result in an unnecessary hardship and practical difficulties on all reasonable use of the land intended by the existing zoning, as opposed to convenience or benefit of the applicant or a specific application. And staff's opinion was that it is reasonable, that it's unnecessary hardship and a practical difficulty because of the circumstances in which the owner and operator has found themselves as a result of changes occurring around the site over time.
I agree with that. Yeah.
I think because of the historic precedent, I think that's very reasonable.
Thank you. Finding C is that the need for the variance is due to specific and unique physical conditions on the site that do not exist on similarly situated land in the area. Staff recommended that we're in support of this finding. The proximity of this location to the downtown, the entertainment and kind of, I don't want to call it the bar district, but the entertainment and social gathering space for the community of the downtown. It's certainly light industrial because of its proximity to the railroad and historic uses, but it's just as much a part of the old town commercial vibe. And that existing condition, the existing configurations for the space are unique to this area.
I agree with that. Yep.
Did it skip one? It's finicky. There we go. Finding D, the manner in which the strict application of the regulation deprives the applicant of reasonable use of the land compared to other similarly situated land in the area. And staff's opinion was that we support this. The bar or tavern is a use by right as opposed to a conditional use that requires a different process. Because it's a use by right and supported in the land use code, staff was in support of this in addition to
agree with
prior uses. Finding E is the circumstances warranting the variance are not the result of actions by the applicant or could not be reasonably avoided by actions of the applicant. As we've discussed a little bit earlier, the land use code has changed, the zoning map has changed that created on one side a positive that the previously conditional use approval was required for these types of uses. Now they're used by right, but it created the variance or the separation requirement. Staff was supportive of this based on the changes were not the result of the applicant doing something on site.
Agree.
And, oh, we included this slide, probably could have thrown it in there earlier too. But this is showing the previous zoning map and then the recently amended zoning map. So you can see the property located here. Cursor is kind of hard to see white on white, but along the railroad and along First Street is where the property is located. And it was zone light industrial. It's still zone light industrial. Some of these properties along McKinley and along First Street were previously zoned transitional, a commercial zoning category. And under the new zoning map amendments, many of those became residential categories. So that shortened that distance by these lot frontages are, I think on average 50 feet frontages or more. So a significant reduction of the space that would have otherwise previously been allowed from a residential property.
So on the prior zoning map, those pink, that was transitional.
Yes, yep. And the transitional was a commercial category, so it does significantly change where that 500-foot would fall for this particular application.
Dark red is the commercial? No, the dark.
On the current zoning map,
C2, isn't it?
That's the downtown zoning, right?
yeah, on the current zoning map, again, my cursor's on the right side there, that's the downtown core commercial category. The areas here, orangish kind of color
What's the
is
bright red
residential.
right across from the?
Oh, here?
Yeah.
Oh, that's C1 community commercial. That community commercial was proposed on this. There's, yeah, dynamic image sign shop is there, and a storage use. Yep. Any other questions on the zoning map? Perfect. So finding F is granting the variance does not adversely affect the public health, safety, and welfare, and in fairness to the applicant, substantial justice is done. Staff supported this. We don't feel that the proposed bar or tavern that would support production and distribution of alcoholic beverages, in addition to the events described by the applicant, would be a negative for public health and safety. We do feel like that the site design has, including fences and screening, has adequately mitigated adverse impacts.
And maybe worth noting for the record, I think our public comment is quite the opposite, that the landscaping might actually improve public health and happiness in that neighborhood. And so I think it's worth noting that there is feedback that is quite, the opposite, that's much in support of this theme.
Thank you. Any other comments or feedback on finding F? Finding G is that the relief requested is the minimum necessary to alleviate the hardship and practical difficulties. As we've discussed, the proposed reduction to the nearest residential property is from 500 feet to 158 feet. That's just as a reminder that 158 feet is from the nearest residential property line to the nearest building wall of the proposed use. And that without significantly altering the existing structures on site, that would be the minimum setback distance to achieve the desired business use.
The other way to look at this is at some point in the past, it was 0 buffer. So we actually increased it to 158 feet. Right?
Well, I think we're dealing with it's two existing buildings. And so really what we're voting is to accept the existing facilities as is. We're not even building anything new or tearing anything down.
Yeah.
Thanks for patience as I was making a note. Finding H is that the relief requested is consistent with any prior approvals and official plans and policies created under the guidance of the plan for these areas, such as the comprehensive plan or specific area plans like a downtown corridor study or et cetera. We've discussed this a little bit in the introduction, but staff found that staff was supportive of this finding H based on the comprehensive plan goals and recommendations. The land use map is consistent with the future land use map element of the comprehensive plan supports this. Adaptive reuse of the existing agricultural structures and reflecting the town's agricultural heritage were positive findings for town staff. Supporting local businesses to increase business and employment in a commercial area is supportive. And prior approvals included a tap room for Old Colorado Brewery for a number of years at the same location. So prior approvals are consistent with the current request, and so staff was supportive.
Yep, agreed.
So those were the findings. In some, staff supports the request for a variance to reduce the 500-foot buffer to 158 feet. I think we actually advertised it as 150 feet. The reason I've done that in the past is because it's really hard to nail it on an imaginary line. Sometimes it's a stoop for the front door needs to be added, and then it's a question, did we modify the the request or not? So when we advertised it, we built an 8-foot buffer into it. But we can certainly have that conversation with the board as to how much flexibility you want to include to the existing front wall of the building or with a little bit of room to spare. But staff is supportive of the request to vary the setback distance to 158 or 150 feet based on the findings in the staff report. And primarily, we highlighted the ones that we felt were the most important to us here in these bullets, but for all the reasons discussed, staff's been supportive of this request.
Is that a recommendation that we say that will allow flexibility of 8 feet to permanent structure?
I-
Or is that in,
What we would do is if that was a desire of the board, and I'm sorry, I could have definitely mentioned that earlier. But what I would recommend is when a board grants a variance, it's defining a minimum or a maximum. And so if you define it at 158 feet, which is the existing front wall of the building, if, down the road, the applicant were to say, we need to expand our use by 2 feet to accommodate a vestibule, there would be a question as to whether or not they're in compliance with that standard. So there are some things that can change even through, and Ms. Souls has submitted a building permit request for a storage structure associated with the light industrial operations of her business. We anticipate working with Ms. Souls on building permits for remodel of the space for the bar, tavern, special events. And we haven't yet seen what those building plans will look like. There may be some desire to and bump that out a couple feet. So a little bit of flexibility can go a long way
but
if it's reasonable for the variance.
procedurally, is that a recommendation since everything we've approved has said 158 till now? Everything that we're saying yes to.
Oh, no, we were just.
Yeah, well, I
we were
mean,
just
but,
talking because that's what exactly it is right now.
well, right, but I'm just saying, do we say that in our approval or do we make it a recommendation?
Well, when we make the motion, we'd say something like, we make a
Change the
motion
language.
to approve the variance to reduce the setback from 500 feet to 150.
Okay.
Mhm.
To X,
Okay.
yeah. And
That's-
so
I
it
was just
doesn't have
saying
to be,
procedurally-
158 sounds.
No, that's fine. I was
really
just asking
anal.
procedurally when we make note that we're changing it from everything here that says 158 to.
Mhm.
Yeah, so essentially the recommendation is to either approve or not approve. And if it's to approve, then it may or may not have conditions. And that's essentially what we'll be doing.
Right,
Right.
and the condition may state absolutely no more can it be reduced than 158, or it can say absolutely no more can it be reduced beyond 150.
Okay.
Right.
Fair.
And just as a point of clarification, because it's helpful to think about wall to wall. But as I think about outdoor events, I think about porches and some kind of temporary cover. I mean, does that then create a potential violation, or is it literally wall to wall? For as long as the porch is not connected to the building, then there's no violation, right? So
Well, that's-
at what
Yeah.
point is the structure,
I,
Yeah.
the structure?
I think if we use the language in architecture, it's considered permanent structure
Mhm.
versus wall. A property line is fine, but but a porch is a permanent structure. So you say I think anything temporary, seasonal doesn't count as a permanent structure, but like a giant pillar would be, or like a porch or a vestibule, those are all permanent structures.
Yeah.
And that's. part of
Well,
it too,
well,
right?
we'll
But
make it
alcohol
less
will be
complicated.
outside
Mhm.
without structure.
Well, right, I think he's saying how to measure that, the 150 is,
Well, I see what he's saying, like, and I get where you're going with that, because there's gonna be alcohol consumption outside the building. Correct.
And I believe that's the intent. And of course, under a liquor license, the premise has to be defined by an edge. So a fence, a
Yeah.
barrier, something that says that beyond this point, no alcohol can be served or consumed. So that would be a defined point on the site.
So since we're considering a setback of 500 feet for the liquor license, wouldn't that be the consideration point?
Not for the liquor license, is for the.
Well,
industrial.
It's for the
Yeah.
use. Mhm. It might,
use, not whether or not it's a bar or tap room. It's that zoned use has a setback. Yeah.
you want to speak?
okay.
It might be helpful, since we're having some discussion around, currently, I think the conversation's maybe, is it 8 feet? Because I threw that out there as a,
You
as
threw
a,
a
as a
wrench in it.
benchmark. Yeah,
Well
my
done.
apologies. It might be helpful if the board is willing, Chairman Stahl. Ms. Souls, I think, might have some feedback on how much flexibility might be needed to achieve the desired intent.
Yeah, trying to, I don't have the measurements with me right now, unfortunately, but so the building setback, and that's the 158 to where the residential use, or where the property for the resident starts. So it's from our front door to residential is the 158. But there is definitely the intent to where the old Colorado Brewing patio went to. It's currently cemented. It's the old scale that was there. That's where we intend to have the patio behind a fence, and that ideally would have, we'd be able to have alcohol there.
Do you have
So-
is that patio affixed to the structure, or is it separated from the structure?
It's a historic structure itself, is what you're saying, right?
Well, it is existing.
Well, and existing to me, I don't know that matters so much as much as is it, and Cody, this may be, from your perspective. So if there's a existing patio that's not connected to the mill, not affixed in any way to the mill, then the 158 is from the mill to the resident, right? Not from a patio, right? Here's another way to put it, right? I've got a picnic table with an umbrella. I'm gonna serve alcohol. That's, to me, there may be some issues with a liquor license around some of that, right? But that wouldn't have anything to do with a setback.
Yeah,
Right.
the liquor license is completely separate.
Yeah.
And that,
And I'm not worried about that. at
yeah,
all,
that
right?
licensing authority will look at a site diagram that illustrates this is the perimeter where alcohol can be served.
So if
And that's separate and apart from. So for me, my concern in terms of, I just want to understand both the intended use and then also what the expectations are for the setback. Because if the intended use is to build a covered patio of some kind out in that area, that makes perfect sense to me. If it's not affixed to the building, and the setback is an issue of the building, not any other patio structure, then we know what that setback needs to be. But if it happens to be affixed to the building, then now all of a sudden we're talking 75 feet, right?
as a point of clarification, just from experience navigating this sort of stuff in other municipalities. You're talking about enclosed habitable space typically. So it would be literal building. Unless the exterior space, and I'm saying this is fairly broad, I'll say Fort Collins, Windsor, Timnath, I mean, this would be if the exterior space was meant to be habitable year round, it was affixed structurally to the ground, structurally to the building, was considered enclosed space, it would fall under this what we're talking about, and we would have to make a recommendation, maybe doing this. It does not apply to space where people may be hanging out for a concert with a beer. This is just building to building. Typically in other municipalities, it is literally building wall, enclosed space, inhabitable space,
And if that's.
air conditioned,
No, I get
heated,
that.
vestibule.
But previously you said if it was a porch attached to the building, it would be that would be considered
If
part
it's
of the building,
considered permanent space,
not
yeah.
enclosed. So now we're removing the
Yeah.
enclosed. So from your perspective, what? is
Yeah,
it
I think it's-
enclosed or not
I think it's
enclosed?
fair. I also think I understand the spirit of this, meaning it's really habitable space that we're really, really concerned about, not necessarily. And I think a patio, a permanent patio meant to be used year round, enclosed or not, meant to be used year round, it could be considered habitable space. But I think just a temporary space where a band will play in the summer and people hang out, and then in the winter, it's not heated, it's not taken care of. I don't think that counts as habitable space, and I don't think it is in the spirit of this setback.
I think that a lot of those comments are really valid, and not to take away from what was said, but I wanted to just share some additional perspective, if you will. And I pulled up the site plan here. This is actually the landscape plan. I think it illustrates the site pretty well. What we've been talking about is a point somewhere right in here near the front entry to the, I'm sorry, that's really hard to see that cursor. But we're talking about a point that's defined, near this front wall of the building. And when you look at the proposed site redevelopment plan, one of the conversations we've had a lot of dialogue with the applicant and their designers about is bringing this front area up to current standards for paved parking. Currently, this area has basically a rollover curb for the entire width of the lot. And one of the points we made really early on is we can't allow a 100-foot wide vehicular access point like it was before. It needed to be very clearly defined, and that's being proposed to be accomplished using curb and gutter and including a new sidewalk here where the sidewalk doesn't exist currently, to improve that space, defining these edges and buffers with trees and landscaping. The parking lot is laid out in a way that is, meeting the minimum requirements for parking stall depth, two-way circulation for vehicles. And they have the entrance to the building as a ramp up for ADA accessibility. So these spaces between the front wall of the building and the property line are very defined as to this is the minimum required to meet the design requirements. So I don't believe that there's going to be significant changes or alterations to this area because of the need for all the other site design elements.
Yeah.
So where would the outdoor events be relative to this space? Here?
A little north than that, but basically right to the east of that parking. Yep.
This area?
Yep, exactly, right there.
Yeah, and so that's where, for me, just understanding, are we measuring from here? Because this is the easternmost point, or do we need to measure from here? Right? See what I'm saying?
Mhm.
If this is the outdoor space that may or may not have a structure that may or may not be considered
Mhm.
habitable or not habitable.
Yeah.
Then that tells me we need to measure from here over, so it might be 125 feet,
Mhm.
right? I don't know if it's-
Yeah, I don't know that's 125. Paul, do you happen to recall any more specifics on where that point was measured to from the nearest residential? Was it to the front door? Was it to the edge of patio?
Front door.
Okay.
on the
Okay.
opposite to the side of the building.
Okay. So, Ms. Souls, do you have or it may be on your other site plan sheet?
It's probably 3, I bet.
Do you know if it's What size that sidewalk?
The
Well-
proposed sidewalk was 4 foot 6 inches.
along the road.
Wow.
I was gonna say, I think it's sort of eyeball it, but.
So I switched plan sheets and I was going to the site civil design to see if we had some dimensions on there.
That says 20.
I'm in favor of what you're
Yeah.
doing. I just want to make sure we don't
Mhm.
end up with a number hit on day
Yeah.
one, puts you in violation.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Safe to say to go down to 150 feet. I don't
I
think,
think that gives you almost 10 extra feet.
yeah. And I don't think,
The front patio is definitely wider than 10 feet. So, yeah.
Well, I know, but then we're back to whether or not that counts as.
Yeah, so here's I'm sorry, I didn't mean to
No,
interrupt you.
I'm just saying, we're in the discussion then if that's space that we need to consider.
Can you put this one up?
I certainly can.
Because that's a photograph and
So
those
it,
other things make my eyes.
an easy way to get around this. For this. I guess this is statement and then question. An easy way to resolve this tonight would be to make this measurement contingent on building envelope or front door, allowing that 150 feet to building envelope. Can we request that the planning board, who will have way more detailed plans and time to review them, review patios and significant improvements made to historic in the spirit of this variance? I mean, can we do that? Can we kick some of this to the planning board, who will have a better way to actually see what's required by code
Mhm.
and all this thing? And can we make ours simply to building envelope?
So I'll speak to that, and I see that you have a comment. The role of the planning commission in considering a site plan is they have a different set of findings for approval that they will look at. They're looking at, does the site conform to all of the applicable design standards for the district in which it applies? So the planning commission would be looking at the parking, the landscaping, ADA accessibility, building elevations, screening, all those elements. The planning commission does not have the authority to overcome a variance that's approved by the Board of Adjustments. So if this board were to define, this is the number, whatever that number is, the planning commission can't then say, oh, and we're gonna push it a few more feet. They don't have that authority, and this board can't
Right.
grant that authority.
But if we don't, well, I'm more saying if we don't want to be the ones to determine whether that patio is. I'm just saying, I think in reading the land use code, that this setback is meant to be to building envelope. And I think that that is what we should determine and leave all exterior planning
I
to the
agree.
planning board, because they
100%.
have better information. And I don't think that's I think we're starting to get into a place where it doesn't matter to the variance. It matters where the building is.
Right.
And it matters where we want to say the building needs to stop, because we don't want somebody to come along and do an addition that goes all the way.
To the street.
whatever.
That's right.
But I think it's the planning commission's job to make sure the site plan is appropriate. But it's our job to say where the building needs to be limited in the spirit of this land use code.
The way I look at it is that the building is permanent and the patio, no matter how big it is
Whether it's-
temporary. People are there for a couple hours for a concert, then it's done, but the building's gonna be there all the time. So if you
Whether-
double the size of the building, you have a mess.
Whether or not
Mhm.
that patio is affixed to the building or not.
Right. So I think we should say ours is to face a building, or the maximum of where the face of building. can be.
So is 150 feet enough, or should it be 140?
Well, I'm glad you asked that. What Miss Lundy has done for me here while we've been chatting, pulling up a geographically referenced map, did a measure from the property line of the nearest house to the edge of patio, and it's, I'll say approximately 146 feet. So
45.
So a variance to 145 or 140 should accomplish what I think we were hearing from the applicant is.
And that's edge of parking.
It's the edge, no, it's the edge of the existing
I-
concrete
Yes,
for the
So-
existing site.
in theory, any addition made to the building wouldn't probably go further than that anyhow. So I think that's fair.
Yeah, and likely would be difficult for any board to approve that when the required parking has to be there to satisfy the building
I think
needs,
that's
so.
fair, and I think that just keeps us
140.
dealing with what we need to deal with. Oh,
So
now
can we
it's
go to
140.
140, be safe.
These people are just.
Yep.
One of the other, just going back to the staff report and the suggested recommendations, one of the other recommendations was substantial compliance with the proposed site development plan. Knowing that the planning commission still has to vet the full site development plan, the applicant has the proposed site plan. This is the proposed site plan that will be going to the planning commission in a few weeks. Substantial compliance would honor that this board looked at. There's going to be parking and sidewalks and things of that nature that wouldn't be future buildings and other uses of those space. The planning commission will have to look at this as to whether or not they need to change anything to meet a standard, but that substantial compliance would honor the intent of what this board was looking at and considering in the variance request.
So does this board
Mhm.
need to just say, we approve being flexible about the variance or reducing the variance from 500 feet to what's necessary? Or does it have to have a minimum amount?
Define a minimum.
We
so
have to
that-
define,
yeah.
okay,
Mhm.
Especially because there will be other tenants in the future and you absolutely do not want to leave.
that's probably
that.
true.
Yeah.
So I'm still going with 140.
And I also want to look to Ms. Souls, hearing the discussion and knowing your business plan and your your site desires. Does the conversation you're hearing make sense for what you're seeking?
Absolutely. Yeah, I wish I could go run and, put a tape on that, but I think 140 is good.
Thank you.
With respect to the
Mhm.
possible conditions that were recommended, from my perspective, I like them all with one possible tweak. Procedurally, Cody, does it make sense for us to kind of walk through possible conditions before we get to the point of a possible motion? Or do we make a motion first and then go through conditions?
No, the motion should include
The
recommended conditions.
So we should talk through this. Yeah, all right.
Yes. Do you want me to recap the findings? I think everyone was pretty clear, but I can certainly run through those if you'd like.
They were all from SAP.
I think we found positive for all of them. There were a couple of additions with some comments, but it was supportive for all.
So what's your condition that you think should be added?
Okay, so on page 10, the condition A, I think we just agreed is 140. I liked all the other conditions as they were written. On condition C, site plan shall provide significant buffering and screening, landscaping along the eastern property to mitigate potential impacts to the existing residents and public right of way. I like that. My only concern is day of install, it's gonna be beautiful. How's it gonna look 3 years down the road? And so what I would say is that it's maintained annually. Otherwise, we risk having a great open house and then 3 to 5 years down the road, trees have died and fences haven't been maintained, right?
Mhm.
So
I
that,
think
that would be the other one that's the only one I would tweak.
something else you brought up earlier that could be added in, not so much again for this resident, but any future residents is maintenance or installation of that fence along the west side as well. I think you brought up a good point that, there's a train. I get it, but I think it's worth saying as a condition that there be a fence along the west boundary as well. And I know she intends to put one there, but that would prevent someone
Yep.
from taking it down.
I guess the question there would be, we are planning on putting up a fence for the vast majority of the west-hand side, but there's we're planning on putting up a west-facing deck that would sit about in the contour of the property but it's the first level, but it actually sits about 45 inches off the ground. Then would we need to have a fence on the west side of that patio?
Are
If,
you-
if that is the.
You're not
condition-
fencing the property
condition.
line on the west?
Well, it is already possibly not the whole thing. We want
Hmm.
to block the whole.
You want a
there.
view.
We
You
want
want
a
a
view.
view. Yeah.
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 I think you could say substantial amount, and that would be within interpretation, but it also would explain the intent of you wanting you could even say for sound dampening purposes.
I threw the site plan back up on the screen for reference, and the wood patio
Oh,
is what you're
yeah.
referring to, Ms. Souls?
Yes.
So how would you characterize that, the use of that space in the context of your other outdoor activities? It's not exactly close to where the band would be performing. So would the outdoor impacts be the same as the other outdoor activities for that west side?
No, that's just going to be seating. There's not enough space for music and things
Yeah, I
back
think,
there.
I think from my perspective, I would say that the west side could be addressed through fencing or other structures to help buffer sound. In my mind, a patio like that would help buffer sound.
Well,
The
or-
building itself buffers. the
Yeah,
sound
sure.
from the
yeah.
Residential area,
Sure.
so the fencing, if you wanted to really buffer sound, would only have to go from the end of the building to the north
Mm-hmm.
and the south, from the building to the south property line.
Yeah, how do we
So
how do we
that
make,
building
how do we
is huge.
put that into language for, because I agree, I think
Not even the word adjustment is a problem.
I
mean,
think
that's sort of a.
we have, since we're requiring fencing and landscaping on one side, it's okay that we add a recommendation that there be consideration made for the west side as well, but maybe that's all we say is that there's consideration made for sound attenuation on the west side. And not make it really specific that it has to be a fence or trees, but that any tenant who takes over has to just make some effort to analyze sound attenuation on the west side as well as the east.
Yeah, and
How do
Well, I
you,
was
how do
just-
you access the wood patio on the west side?
Be from the inside of the elevator.
So you go straight through.
Yeah. The goal is to make that an additional egress.
And so your view would be to the west, and you
Mhm.
would have doors, you would
Mhm.
have doors that open up from the building to access that patio.
Mhm.
That would allow the band's sound to go through, correct?
Well, keep it, the inside space is pretty small. So I guess if a door was open to the outside from the
Okay, so the bands will be outside typically.
typical.
So
Mhm.
realistically, there's not much sound transfer going further west of the patio.
Correct.
So in reality,
The
is there,
building
is
is
there a
still a
need,
screen, yeah.
is there a need to
Mhm.
have a fence in front of, to the west side of that patio? Because the fence could
Yep, I agree.
start, the fence could stop at the north corner of
I think
the
that's
building.
what she was saying. Yeah.
Okay.
And Ms. Souls, the fence primarily is to limit access for patrons and vehicles to
Mhm.
get to the railroad right of way. It'll define an edge for liquor license
Mhm.
purposes.
Mhm.
You're proposing an 8-foot privacy fence. I imagine some of that is also to buffer your events from potential train noise as much as it is
And the
noise going
wind.
the other way and the wind.
I
Fair.
think my question is, how do we, I think she's achieved it in a really acceptable way. How do we ensure that future tenants, if there are future tenants, how do we ensure that they pay the same respect to the residents of Wellington West, which is just across the railroad tracks? That this tenant is, I think that's where I'm at, is like, do we add something in here, some sort of language that takes what she has done and makes sure that any future tenant does this as a minimum as well.
Mhm. Can I offer a suggestion?
Please.
And I'm trying to honor the intent of what I'm hearing, so I'll take a stab at the language. I'm looking at recommendation C
Mhm.
in the staff report. Potentially that could be modified to say that the site plan shall provide and maintain significant buffering and screening, landscaping and fences along the eastern property line and western property line to mitigate the outdoor activity.
That's what I was going
Perfect.
for.
And don't
Yes,
get
that's
so
perfect.
specific with what it is. Yeah.
And,
Yep.
yeah,
like
and
that.
then further down the list, condition E, approval of a site plan review by the planning commission is also one of the recommendations, and it's a procedural step that has to go through anyhow. What that effectively would do is that if the planning commission approves a site plan that includes a fence or landscaping or some combination thereof, the condition would be binding on maintaining that planning commission approval in the form that it was approved.
Yeah, I like that wording. I agree with it.
And then I just have a question for the other board members. Do we think that 11 PM is fine, or do we need to look up what downtown allows for sound? Do you think it matters? Do you think anyone will get upset?
If I may, I'd like
Yeah,
to
go
address the,
Go ahead.
the restricting of the outside, for events for the bar and tavern. We are being classified as bar tavern, going for, we desire a full liquor license. But the spirit of this space, the initial tenant is looking, it's called The Well, a community space. I guess I'm hesitant to unduly restrict outside events. You know, a great example is, as it's listed right now, events couldn't start until 11 AM on a Sunday. What if we wanted to have a yoga on our front patio? Is that, we would be restricting that. So I'd like to respectfully request a wider window of opportunity to have events outside.
Yeah, I appreciate that clarification. I mean, from my perspective, my concern is really around noise more than what happens outside.
Mhm.
And that was one of the questions what prompted my question about the noise ordinance.
Mhm.
Because really, for me, it's really about the noise more than it is about the activity,
Mhm.
right? Yeah.
I
Yeah,
think,
like if you had a wedding, you'd want to be there till like 10 or
yeah.
11.
However, a lot of venues stop serving at a specific time and have to stop playing music at a certain time. Like pretty much every venue in Colorado, especially ones near residential areas, have really strict because of these things.
Mhm.
So I think it's worth, because we are reducing this setback by over 70% now, because I did some math. I think it's worth contemplating. I think the early morning stuff, to your point, you're not going to be blasting Metallica at 6 in the morning on Sunday.
Metallica yoga,
Can it be goat yoga, please? Anyhow.
right?
But again, I think my concern isn't so much with this client, because this client or this applicant seems extremely responsible, very connected to this community. But since we have to put some of these conditions in, I just think it's worth this conversation, because we may get someone in here who is not as interested in, maybe they want to do Metallica yoga at 6 AM. I'm not sure.
Is this another simple wording game here?
Yeah, that's what I think. It's a
Outdoor
wording game.
events that include amplified.
Yeah. Or,
Well,
Sound.
and maybe potentially, and I also just wanted to kind of look at the existing recommendation in the staff report. It was the staff recommendation was defined as outdoor events associated with the bar or bar tavern facility,
and I think,
because that's the variance is requesting the setback reduction for the bar and tavern, which is associated with, there's a definition for bar or tavern, and it includes
yep.
dispensing and or providing and serving
that would
alcoholic
include
beverages.
mimosas, right?
Yes.
It would.
It could possibly.
But I'm thinking, like the
Devil's
applicant,
adv-
if she's saying she wants to do breakfast yoga,
Mhm.
mimosa yoga, it would restrict her to, what is it, 8 AM then is that what the
Um,
recommendation is, I think?
But that would be,
Yeah,
that
we-
would be controlled by a different entity rule.
No, that has to do with the liquor.
Right, but not with a variance.
But he's saying our variance is because it's a tap room. So our recommendations would be for tap room activities, but she is stating that tap room activities could potentially include earlier morning, and she wants more flexibility to plan events that may or may not include mimosas, Bloody Mary.
Yeah.
Things like
Yeah.
I,
Wouldn't that fall under the liquor license?
yeah.
And the rules
right.
set forth by the
Yeah,
liquor
yeah.
license.
But if we
I-
set specific, hours, what she's saying, it will impact her ability.
Yeah, I'm not in favor of restricting the hours on your business. My concern is the noise. And so for me, if we address the noise concern, whether that's through hours, right?
We just put a
Which
maximum.
means, which means for me, which basically says if we focus it more on
Nighttime.
outdoor amplified noise, right?
Mhm.
So if there's a cutoff then when 8 o'clock comes on Wednesday night, the amplified noise is turned off. The activity can continue till midnight.
Mhm.
Who cares, right?
Well,
It's just not
if I
amplified
can, if I
noise.
can, maybe I can simplify this because, and there's a lot of scenarios that we could throw out there. And I'll play devil's advocate for just a moment to the amplified noise. What if it's just a rowdy poker club? And they're not amplifying any music, but they're being loud and noisy? What if one of those events is the Exactly, and if it was a
Probably join.
morning yoga with mimosas afterwards, I don't expect that we're going to get a lot of complaints where enforcement would be an issue. One of those, 11 PM was recommended for the bar or tavern activities. I don't know that one of those future events that the well might operate could be a stargazing club at 1 o'clock in the morning to view some constellations, and maybe they want to have a couple of drinks. I don't expect that those types of activities are going to result in a noise complaint from Mr. Burke saying, oh my God, they're out here with a telescope. And so we might be overthinking the scenarios. And I think, in my opinion, the intent of the hours of operation for outdoor activities associated with the bar or tavern would be reasonably interpreted by any law enforcement officer or code enforcement officer called to the scene to address noise, would be able to look at these hours were related to the noisy activities associated with a bar, not a stargazing or a yoga type activity.
Can we take away, I think my thought is, can we take away, instead of saying hours of operation and giving the minimum, the 8 AM, the whatever, can we simply say our recommendation is that the noisy activities related to bar and tap room conduct, however we want to say that, is over at 8
I
PM?
think, I think that's what.
Instead of the early, but I'm just saying, as far as language goes, our recommendation, we don't have to say hours of operation. We can just say that specifically related to noise, that the noise should be over whatever events, however we want to say that, is just over at this time. Like, instead of doing the hours of operation and giving that the range, can we just put a maximum time that the concerts need to be over?
I think she's
I
saying
think-
9 PM.
I think that's
Sunday through
Yeah.
Thursday.
Right.
right.
I
Right.
think as a resident, truthfully, I'm trying to think, because my mom lives in this in Wellington West. I think as a resident, if I knew that around 9 o'clock, the concert was going to be over and I could put my kids to bed or whatever, I think it would make me feel better.
I think that's what I heard Cody propose.
Yeah.
So I think you're saying the same
Okay.
thing, different way. My question would be for you, that as you hear that,
Mhm.
do you hear your business is being restricted or in a significant way, or do you hear just that outdoor event?
Well, I guess I do have a concern that with how, if it would read how it's written now, that someone could potentially interpret it to, you can't have an event here
You should be
before
closed.
11 AM.
Yeah.
Mhm.
You know, on a
right,
Sunday, and
right.
I am concerned about
Yeah.
that and would like to keep the options open, especially if it's not including loud amplified noise.
Yeah, I
So-
think we should take away the restriction earlier in the day. And just assume that most bars are not going to have something loud at 6 AM on a Sunday. And I think we should simply put a maximum. I don't know. That's what I think. I think I understand her point in saying that she feels like someone could potentially say she's in violation if she has an event where she serves mimosas at 7 o'clock on a weekday morning, whatever it is. But the major concern surrounding all of this is late night noise and how late we're gonna say that probably would be reasonable for the residents. It's not 11 a.m. on a Sunday, probably, hopefully.
Would night restrictions restrict your business?
You know, I think that's very reasonable. I think if it was said 8 p.m. on the weekdays, that's a little concerning because that's, we're not even really past sunset in the summer, so I'm like, I'm a little concerned about that. So
9 p.m. weekdays, Sunday through Thursday,
I think that seems reasonable. What about the weekends?
11 p.m. on Saturday and Sundays, I think is what I heard.
I think it was Friday, Saturday.
Oh, yeah.
Friday, Saturday.
Friday, Saturday.
How many houses are within the old 500-foot radius?
I
Are
counted
we-
12.
I say,
Okay.
I don't have a count, but I can go back to one of the images that showed the buffer.
I was just curious. I mean, I just really don't think it's that many. Hopefully that would
No,
be.
especially to the west, like you said, of Wellington West, there's 2 houses. One is like right on the 500-foot thing, and one is a little bit
Mhm.
in.
I think
And
they're
so-
the maps.
And it's farther south from where the outdoor,
I think 9 is
you know,
fair.
where the concert would be, and here's the house. It's southwest from the.
I think 9 is fair as a parent. That's pretty much my cutoff for like when I would start going over to my neighbors and saying like, hey, your music's loud, my kids are trying to sleep. But until 9, I kind of feel like it's fairly reasonable. And I think my only question was to the 11 o'clock. Should we keep it the same time as the other downtown business requirements? Like whatever we have those capped at?
I
or-
have looked at that, at least in the land use code. I can't find any restrictions,
Yeah.
so.
They
And-
don't have an end time required in the downtown corridor?
Correct, they don't, and we
Uh-huh.
confirm the
Okay.
same. The closest comparable is for, there's a use standard for breweries, distilleries, and wineries that has the same language for outdoor events associated with those uses are limited to the 11 a.m. to 8 p.m. weeknights and 10 a.m. to 11 p.m.
Oh,
on
then I think
weekends.
if that's the standard, then that's fine. I was thinking that we were extending it by an hour over the other downtown ones, but
No, and it was a good question, and I appreciate you bringing it up because the consistency would be really
Yeah,
important.
we would need to be consistent or else someone would think that we were being
Yeah.
favorite.
I agree. And again, that restriction is for the outdoor activities. So say if 11
Yeah,
PM is what
right.
was considered, those events could still go inside and remain quiet during, or the outdoor activity noise would be limited during those hours.
Well, my thought was if we don't specify times, then if there starts to be an issue where the music goes on till 2 a.m. because that's how late they can serve liquor or something like that, and it becomes a problem. Then because they are close, closer to, well, they aren't really closer than T-Bar but T-Bar doesn't have outside music, but the grill does. And they're just across the alley from some houses. So, if we don't actually specify anything, then we can rely on her best judgment. And if we, like you say, somebody, wants to have a biker bar there, in 20 years, and it's a problem, well, then we haven't said, oh yeah, you can have loud music until 11 o'clock at night when that's really disturbing to the neighborhood as it is. Sometimes when you put down this to this, then everybody goes, well, I have the right to stay here, until such and such a time.
I think as a resident though, since we're supposed to be thinking in terms of health, wellness and safety of the neighborhood, I think it is fair for us to put not the minimum time, not the 11 a.m. I think putting
Yeah.
a maximum time, and I think 11 is fair. The applicant can speak to whether or not she thinks 11 is fair. I think it helps. She's asking in the current land use code for over a 70% variance. That's a giant variance. And I think we look at the intent of the land use code having this buffer, and it's to protect existing and residential from noise, light pollution and all those things. I think it is okay, and it isn't overstepping for us to say the concerns of these residents and any future residents would be likely. Late night noise.
I think that I would like it more open-ended and to leave it to the noise restriction. If we're being an annoying neighbor and we're having a party at 10 PM on a Monday, not that that's the intention by any means, but if that were to happen, for a future owner and business operator, they're going to have the cops called on them and get in trouble in that way. So I guess I'm just like, that seems to be the more reasonable approach, but I also understand the spirit of wanting to put a restriction in place. So I think, 9 PM on the weekdays, but then I go to, okay, if July 4th falls on a Wednesday,
Hey,
and
Nuggets win the playoff, right?
who knows,
Right?
I would
New Year's Eve.
New Year's
Yeah.
Eve, that's right. Well, I go back to noise ordinance. If there's a noise ordinance, then we don't need to add another noise ordinance on top of the noise ordinance.
But I don't think there is a noise.
It's noise ordinance.
Right.
Our noise ordinance is like,
I would-
you have to report it and like, there is no,
Right.
it
And I
is
would-
to the discretion of the officer versus
It
other
is.
municipalities that actually have a noise ordinance where you can tell whether or not someone's in violation. We don't have that.
I think that
English.
that was actually the way that I was leaning, that any given night, if there's a concert going on, it could be 7 o'clock. And someone could call in a complaint and an officer might show up and say, and have
Yeah,
to
this is
then
wrong.
make a prima facie, meaning based on what I'm hearing right now, a determination on whether or not it is reasonable. Who knows what that officer's mindset is at that time? It might depend on, my gosh, I just had my ear torn off by someone. Yeah, it could be. So I don't know that that is in terms of the way staff is looking at this, it's for adjacent residences in the area. It's not necessarily just defining that these are the hours and whether or not 9 o'clock or 11 o'clock or any other time is the right time or the reasonable time, but it's creating a clear expectation that any given weeknight, I know that I can expect the noise is, I shouldn't even say noise, but the outdoor activities would end at this time. And so if it's 9 o'clock and it's 8:55, am I gonna call sheriff's office and say it's 8:55 and I've lost my mind if I know it's gonna stop at 9 o'clock?
I agree.
So
Yeah.
I
that's
think-
kind of the way
I
I
think
was thinking about it.
I think without a noise ordinance that has any measurable way to tell if someone's in violation, we can't lean on a noise ordinance. We can't. I mean, we either have to take that totally out, which we could decide to do, but we can't say that we're going to use the noise ordinance because there is no measurable data to lean on.
Not my problem. It's not really my problem. I don't think it's the board's problem. You know what I mean? I don't, because I'm not in favor. I do agree with the applicant that if the applicant is before the board because there is a setback that's restricting your ability to run your business. And so if we take that away, only to add another one,
Right, but the setback
then we might as well not approve the setback,
exists
right?
for a reason.
What's that?
I just say the setback
No, I get it.
exists for a reason.
I totally get it. And
So-
I'm in favor of approving the variance on the setback. So again, from my point of view, it is about the noise, not the outdoor event. Right? Because otherwise, your business hours have now been defined, right? And so 8 o'clock, Monday through Thursday, or Sunday through Thursday, or whatever it was, you can't do anything outside, noise or not, right? And so to me, if we're gonna do anything around this, it has to be restricted to noise, not outdoor events.
But if we say excessive noise,
How do you define
How do you
excessive?
define
Well, and
excessive
that's why for
noise?
me, I said earlier, 10 minutes ago, amplified. No amplified noise outside, right? Because it's one thing to have the acoustic guitar. And have a little thing going with an acoustic guitar, no big deal, right? It's another thing to have the drums and the electric guitar and everything else going with full amplification,
fully
right?
plugged.
So
Mhm.
amplified noise off at a certain hour. continue the outdoor event, go crazy,
Mhm.
right?
Would lights become an issue at some point as well?
I'm not worried about the lights.
But I feel that that is our duty in interpreting the spirit of what the 500-foot buffer was supposed to do, which would be light, sound, smell. I mean, I don't think we have smell here. Might smell good.
The light is kind of under the planning commission.
Okay.
I believe that's more of a,
Okay.
The permanent lighting would certainly fall under the
I'm
discretion
thinking
of
more,
a site plan review for the planning commission. The question might be is there a, if there's a
venue.
band stage that's lit, wouldn't be, the site plan wouldn't accomplish that for the planning commission approval.
Mhm.
That would be more associated with the outdoor
So
activities.
it's not just noise at that point. It is, again, the outdoor event. And
Right,
is
but-
it reasonable for us to think that the residents would want a specific time that they could expect it to? You go.
This facility is not set up to accommodate a Metallica concert.
Fair.
I mean,
Yeah,
we're,
that's fair.
the events that you are gonna hold, the live music that you're gonna hold are gonna be small bands, I'm assuming, with not a lot of sound equipment, not a lot of lighting. So I think we're blowing a lot of this way out of
I think that's
proportion
fair.
because, I mean, it's not a big space. It's really not. And you can't put that kind of lighting and that kind of sound equipment in a small space and actually be able to have your event. It's just, I don't see any of that working. So I think this is, to me, it's town pump in Fort Collins where you've got a little stage, or one of the Lucky Joe's where you've got a small stage in the back where you can fit a little bit of equipment and a little bit of lighting to accommodate what you're gonna do. So I think a lot of this is just going way outside of
So are
where
we
we need to go.
in favor then of taking away that recommendation? Okay. I think I'm in the minority, but I mean, I understand the reason, so it's fine.
I think freedom is more without. I've got neighbors that rev their cars up sometimes all day Saturday because they're working on it.
They got their own.
And yeah, it annoys me, but it's like, bro, their house.
Ugh, I live with a 4-year-old that doesn't sleep well and noise. It's okay. I mean, like, but I mean,
No,
that's,
I
yeah.
understand, you know.
No, it's okay. I understand. And I think we'll just vote that the majority want to take that recommendation out and then we'll move on to the next recommendation.
And I'll throw out there just from a procedural standpoint, not everyone has to agree.
Yeah.
And there's no motion on the table currently,
No, I'm just saying, I think the
And so-
majority are in support of taking that recommendation out and we'll just talk about the next one.
right? I agree with you. Just throwing out there too, that whoever proposes a motion can propose that motion based on the conditions of approval that that person proposes, and then there may not be a second for it, or there may be a second for it, and then there'll be a vote. I've seen a lot of times where motions get amended, votes may not pass, and an alternative motion may be presented. So there are procedures in your Bob's Rules of Order that would allow something to move forward, and it doesn't mean that everyone has to be unanimous in agreement. So I'm just throwing it out there for the sake of Bob's Rules of Order.
I think the rest of those are all fairly standard and I think we'd be okay to move on to the motion.
Do you want me to recap anything that I've taken notes on? Can certainly run through it real quick.
If you could recap C,
Mm-hmm.
because I think that was helpful for the west side.
Yeah, so based on what I'm hearing, there was for the findings, positive for all the findings supporting the variance. There were a couple of specific comments that I will include in the findings, but they were also supportive. I didn't hear any negative comments. What I'm hearing for the conditions of approval would be the conditions as outlined and written in the staff report recommendations, with the changes including recommendation A, the separation setback reduced to no less than 140 feet. And letter C, that the site plan shall provide and maintain significant buffering and screening landscaping and fences along the eastern and western property lines to mitigate outdoor activity impacts. And I'm hearing remove option D currently.
Yes.
That's what I was hearing. Is that, everyone agree?
Can I say so moved, or does somebody actually have to say all that back out?
Does
Um,
somebody have to, I make a motion to
Do what Cody
reduce
just said.
the-
well, those were the recommendations. You would need to specify if the motion was to approve with conditions.
There's 4 more conditions. Do we want to just quickly go through those? E, F, G, and H?
I think those are.
Everybody okay with those?
Mhm.
Okay. So I'll make a motion.
Well, can I use the verbiage that's been allowed?
Yep.
Okay, so, for some reason, the page numbers get pretty much.
I can do it too.
Duration to be no less than 140. We just kind of.
And
be out.
So first, though,
I-
you have to make the motion that's listed here first, right?
Mhm.
Before we
I-
talk.
If it's helpful, I can state what I'm hearing as the proposed motion, and if everyone agrees, then you can say so moved.
Okay, let's do that.
Okay,
Because you do have verbiage here and I could just read it, but we would probably end up there anyhow. So,
okay, I'll throw it out there, and
Okay.
if everyone, based on what I've heard, and I've heard everyone say that they're largely in support of the variance, so I'm going to make that to approve with conditions. So the motion I'm hearing may be to move to grant a variance to vary section 4.03.3 A, use specific standards to reduce the minimum separation setback required of the light industrial zone district for 8121 First Street from 500 feet to 140 feet, subject to the conditions included in the staff report A through H, with the exception of A, the reduce the setback to no less than 140 feet, change condition C to the site plan shall provide and maintain significant buffering and screening, landscaping and fences along the eastern and western property lines to mitigate impacts of outdoor activities, and removal of condition D.
You can actually strike condition A because the motion includes.
Oh, that's fair. I agree with that.
so moved.
Okay.
I second it.
Roll.
Member White Alice,
Yes.
Stringer,
Yes.
Stahl,
Yes.
Mullen,
Yes.
Carmen.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Call the meeting at 9 o'clock. Is that the next step?
Are there any communications that you
Yeah.
want to
Yeah.
say?
The communication I was going to share is, thank you all for being here in May. We have not received any applications that would be able to be scheduled for a public hearing for June. So there'll be no meeting in June. And we'll let you know as soon as we learn if there's any applications submitted for July.
Perfect.
Make a motion to adjourn?
Second.
Thirded, fourthted.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Of course.
Well, I'm excited. I live over near there and when this is completed, I will be able to.
I go to that gym over there and I think it's gonna be great to have some new
Well,
landscape.
We went when it was the other tap room. Thank you. But, bye.
They would have
We
a
were
host
sad
yoga